Today I'm going to be covering Sympathy by Laurence Dunbar. The poem goes, I know what the caged bird feels at last, when the sun is bright on the upland slopes, when the wind stirs soft through the springing grass, and the river flows like a stream of glass, when the first bird sings and the first bud opes, and the faint perfume from its chalice steals. I know what the caged bird feels. I know why the caged bird beats its wing, till its blood is red on the cruel bars. For he must fly back to his perch and cling, when he fain would be on the boa swing. And they pulse again with a keener sting. I know why he beats his wing. And a pain still throbs in the old scars. I know why the caged bird sings, ah me, when his wing is bruised and his bosom sore, when he beats his bar and he would be free. It is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why the caged bird sings. So before we start analyzing the poem, some background information that we need to be aware of is that this poem was written in 1899. This is when the Jim Crow laws were in effect. So basically these laws were discrimination against African American citizens. Even though the claim was separate but equal, it was still far from equal. So to break this poem down, we're going to talk about the dramatic situation, the speaker, the audience, the tone shift, the imagery, and the literal and figurative meaning. For the dramatic situation, the speaker describes how the bird is trapped within this cage. At first, it describes the setting of nature and the feeling of a big open world. But then it zooms in on this bird trapped in this little cage. And it makes you feel about how small the bird feels compared to the rest of the world that's passing by with time, and it's just stuck in one spot. The point of this is to irritate the audience. It wants to make the reader feel uncomfortable with being trapped within this cage compared to the world that's happening around it. It wants to join the world. It wants to make the reader feel like the bird and want to get out of the cage, feel free. Now this makes you beg the question, who is the speaker and who is the audience? Well, the speaker would most definitely be the author of the poem, who is talking about the bird in the cage from a third person perspective. Meanwhile, the audience is probably somebody who can observe the kind of discrimination against African Americans and can kind of relate to how the author feels when he talks about being discriminated against and still feeling like he's in a cage, like he's oppressed. This is apparent because of how the author tries to make the audience feel through the words of his poem how the bird feels when it's caged up. He wants to go off of how people feel more for defenseless animals than they do for people. He wants to remind them that people are people and they should be treated with respect, and that he should not feel like a bird in a cage trying to get out. Next we will talk about the tone and the tone shifts within this poem. To be a bit on the nose, the tone throughout this poem is sympathetic. The author feels how the bird is and can understand what it's going through because he relates to it on a personal level. Next we're going to talk about the imagery and the other literary devices that the speaker used to argue their point and persuade the audience. The most significant literary device used in this poem is imagery, but there are other ones such as diction, repetition, and analogies to help the speaker emphasize their point. To start off, imagery is very apparent within each of the three stanzas. However, in the first one, the stanza talks about mostly describes like nature, like when it says, when the sun is bright on the upland slopes, when the wind stirs soft to the springing grass, and the river flows like a stream of glass, when the first bird sings and the first bud opes, and the faint perfume from its chalice steals. So basically, it's talking about nature and kind of talking about like the world as in its entirety in order to make everything seem so big and stuff like that. And as I said earlier, the second stanza really narrows it down and makes it focus on the bird as it's trapped within the cage. It makes you think about like how insignificant the bird feels because it says how the bird beats its wing until its blood is red on the bars, and how he has to just perch on like a branch. It's not even like a real branch, and he's just always trying to get out and join this big open world, but he can't because he's trapped. Like in the second stanza, it doesn't mention the nature anymore. It just talks about the bird in the cage and how it's trapping him from his true potential. The third stanza is still focusing on the bird within the cage, but then it goes to talk about how the wing is bruised and his bosom is sore, and that he keeps trying to beat the bars. It makes you think about someone who's so persistent about getting out and just so determined, and that they're just crying out for help. And it's kind of for help, but it's also kind of like for someone to show mercy on them and to end them right there, because he feels within the cage that there's nothing better for him, that he's trapped where he is, and he just wants to die. That's why he says, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. So that's mostly talking about how he's crying for help. He's crying for God to like smite him down, just so he doesn't have to endure this pain anymore of just being trapped and being unable to go from anywhere. He just feels stagnant, and that's driving him nuts, driving him crazy. So the imagery and diction go hand in hand because the kind of wording that you use gives off a certain image. So mostly the speaker uses words that in the first stanza to make you feel like the world around you is big, and then while in the second stanza it makes you feel like pain, and then in the third stanza it makes you feel like sad. So for the first stanza it makes you feel like you're in this huge world because it talks about like the sun and the slopes, like is like they're mountains, and the wind and the grass and fields and like that, and like the river looking like a stream of glass because of how like transparent and like opaque kind of it is. And then for the second stanza and how it makes you feel pain because of how there's like blood, and then it talks about like the cruel bars, like, and how he has to like perch on that branch, and it talks about the pain of like the scars and how like they keep getting worse because he keeps using the same parts of his wing to get out, but he can't. And then the third one makes you feel sad because of how he keeps, like, it still talks about him beating the bars so that he could be free, and then he cries out for help because he can't really do much with how he is at the moment. He talks about being like using his diction to talk about how the prayer from his song is coming from the heart, very deep in how in its meaning. Lastly, for a talk about the literary devices, we're going to talk about how this is an analogy. So basically, this entire poem is an analogy for how the speaker feels about slavery, because the speaker goes into details about how there's so much more for the bird, being that there is this whole entire world, but it's trapped in a cage, being forced to watch things pass by in front of it, instead of being able to go out there and experience things for itself. It can't like progress or regress. It's all about being stagnant, and that like lack of movement is an analogy for how he feels as an African American in the 1890s, because even though slavery was abolished, he still feels the discrimination. Like you can change society, but like you can change the rules of society, but you can't change how society feels about something. Like there's always going to be some feeling that is associated with a law, and not everyone's always going to agree with it. So in this case, a lot of people don't agree with it, and they still feel a bit awkward that African Americans are considered a part of society. So now we can talk about the literal meaning versus the figurative meaning. So the literal meaning of this poem would be to be more considerate about people like other than yourself, because like usually we think about who we are as individuals and not really considering how other people are with their circumstances. But on a more figurative look on it, it kind of makes you think about the makes you think about the background in which the poem was written in, and like the time and where it was exactly. So in this instance, it was like 1899 and in the United States. So this was like right after slavery was abolished, and people were starting to get more adjusted to African Americans walking around the streets with them, and this is where like people started getting uncomfortable and then starting to try to have the Jim Crow laws and segregate everybody, and like separate but equal, but that's not a thing. They were segregated, and that still made them feel oppressed. Like the whole point of this was to make the audience realize the kind of emotions that this made African Americans feel, and that they should try to work to have society not only legally accept blacks into their communities and that, but also accept them like on an emotional level, I guess, from that outlook. Thinking about this kind of literal and figurative kind of meaning makes you think about how complex it is. Well, this poem overall is not that complex because it's very apparent from each individual stanza about what each stanza is supposed to be about, with how the first is about the big open world, stanza 2 is about the small and insignificant feeling of the bird from inside the cage, and then the third one's about like the real deep and kind of emotional like pain that like it's not just emotional, it's also physical and spiritual pain that the bird is going through. So it's not really like too complex of a poem to see what it's about, and I think this is intentional because the speaker wanted everyone to understand what he was saying. He didn't want to focus on a certain group. He wanted everyone who had the ability to vote and to like read be able to know like what exactly he was getting, like what he was talking about. He didn't want to beat around the bush for certain people. He didn't want people to like not understand what he was saying. So yeah, you can also tell that this poem is not that complex because of how the title is perceived. It's just sympathy, and that's the dictionary definition for that is feelings of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune. So it's very straightforward on what the speaker is trying to get at from the audience. He just wants people to understand what he is going through, even though he's talking about it through the bird, that it still relates and that people still feel trapped. Even though it's not legal anymore to discriminate, there's still like feelings of oppression, and that they should try to work as a community to fix that. Overall, this poem is an analogy of African Americans struggling with discrimination and being cut off from their full potential. It is a tragedy of knowing they are capable of so much, if not confined to do so little. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment down below, and remember to break out your cages, people.